Okay, hello, dear philosophers, fellow Hegelians, non-Hegelians, anti-Hegelians, Schopenhauerians. I don't think that the anti-Hegelians followed us until up to this moment, but yeah, we want to go on with our readings of the lectures of the history of philosophy. And we discussed last time the notion of development, which is actually the question of how the idea develops, and that development is all of what it is, which means it flows. It flows, it flows, it flows, and it's always changing. Everything changes, but change itself does not change. We know this principle very well. We have heard that very often from Heraclitus. And of course, it's more difficult when we come to a philosophy of Hegel because it's dialectics. And he believes that truths cannot be just formulated in simple sentences because then they would be empty and abstract, which is their real truth is that they develop. And so it is also for the idea that everything flows. Okay, so everything flows is also only true if we go through the dialectic of that statement. And there are a lot of contradictions included in the idea that everything flows. Because, for example, if everything flows, what then is flowing? What is the thing that is flowing? If we say the thing that flows is nothing, then it cannot be everything, right? If it is something else than everything, then it's not everything that flows. You get the spiel. I don't want to get into that, but this is usually what we call the Hegelian dialectics, and here we get a taste of it, and I hope it makes you addicted, because it helps you in so many regards. I hope it does not make you addicted in a sense that you go to everyone and says, oh, this is just dialectic, and you try to be smart with it. Or that we come to the conclusion that because everything flows and nothing really means what it is, that you say dialectic means that we never have to say sorry. However, we don't want to deal just with memes, with simple truths. We want to do the hard labor of the mind. Therefore, let's get immediately back to the text. And there we said, okay, we want to talk about the idea before. The idea alone is truth. It's the idea of the totality of thought. That is what the idea is. And the point of the nature of the idea is that it is just to develop. It's develop in order to arrive at a comprehension of itself. This is what we have already discussed. And then we came to the notion of development. And we wanted to say, what is this development? What is the idea developing towards? And we said, well, you know, the development can be best understood if we think about it in terms of potential and actuality. Man, for example, who's the main vehicle of the idea trying to capture itself, is potentially reasonable. And at the same time, he is actually reasonable. Now, potentially reasonable can be easily explained when you have an embryo or sleeping man. They are not really actualizing their potential of reason. But when they actualize it, they still also have a larger potential, namely to capture the whole of reason. And the whole of reason can never be captured in just one moment, so therefore the implicitness of the idea is still there, but it's also made explicit in a sense. And the idea is both of it at the same time, and it's best captured if we say, well, the core essence of the idea is that it keeps developing, and all that is its activity. Okay, so we have clarified that. Therefore, now let's go to the next chapter, which is the notion of the concrete. And we want to here actually combine the idea of development and the idea that the idea is concrete. So after we have developed the idea of what development is, I'm sorry, I use idea too much. Let's say of the concept of what development is, we now want to develop the concept of the concrete. So what is the concrete? As to development, it may be asked, what does develop and what forms the absolute content? Yeah, and that's what I already said, right? Like a pure development without a content cannot exist. So we somehow have to say something about what is developing and what is actually flowing. Again, we have here a notion of absolute. I already said that, like in the tradition before Hegel, the absolute was usually understood to be God, because he was entirely determined by itself, through himself, and nothing other than himself. Now, we want to achieve the same for human thought. That's why we consider reason, where reason is the subjective activity, makes itself an object, and thus becomes an identity that is only determined through itself, by itself, and will also remain itself in that sense. And then we can say this is certain kind of independence from anything else, and then we have an absoluteness that Hegel also calls freedom. I hope I don't make that too complicated. Just absolute means here a kind of independence and freedom, okay? But we have to achieve that notion first. So let's go on therefore. Development is considered in the light of a formal process in action and as destitute of content. So development is just developing. It's just formal. But what is the content? If everything flows, what is the content, right? But the act has no other end but activity, and through this activity, the general character of the content is already fixed. So I cannot decode this here completely immediately, but we know that the act of reason, which we still talk about, because we want to develop the totality of the idea in reason, this act is just determined through activity. But in this activity, it can actually make itself determinate. And why is that? He says, for being in itself, here it's just in self, I don't know why, and being for self, I guess that's just a synonym for being for itself and being in itself, are the moments present in action. So what does that mean? We have two moments. We have the implicitness, the potentiality, which he calls for being in itself, and then we have the explicitness, where the content comes to the fore, where the activity is actually seen, and that is what we call being for itself. And both of these moments are present in the action of reasoning. But the act is the retention of the diverse elements within itself. So the act keeps these two elements, which is implicitness and explicitness, at the same time. The act thus is really one. It's the oneness of the two moments. And it is just this unity of differences which is the concrete. So the act of reason, thinking itself, is determining itself. And it's one action, and that is what he calls the concrete. It's where the universal of thought, which is in a sense abstract, the universal of thought captures itself as it thinks itself, it becomes individual. And the combination of the universal and the individual is what we call the particular, or you may also call it the concrete. Not only is the act concrete, but also the implicit, which stands to action in the relation of subject which begins, and finally the product is just as concrete as the action or is the subject which begins. Hegel. Dialectics, right? Just everything moving into itself. So what is he saying here? Again, we are talking about the act of reasoning, and this act is concrete, but also the potential becomes concrete. And this is because if there were not more potential to be actualized, the actualization would stop, right? But it's actualizing, and therefore there needs to be more potential. So, but the actualized potential with which everything begins is concrete. It's there, we can see it in the concrete action, and at the same time, the result of that action is also there because it is a concrete thought, right? So this is what he's saying here. Development in process likewise forms the content. So development without content cannot be, but the development of actualizing its capacity, it's what is the concrete content here, the idea itself. For this, we must have the one element and then the other. So we have to have the potential, then the actualization. We need to have the potential again and the actualization. And now we combine both. And these both combined will form a unity as a third, because the one and the other is at home with and not without itself. This is just a repetition of what I tried to translate into my language. Thus, the idea is in its content concrete within itself, and this in two ways. First, it is concrete potentially, and then it is its interest that what is in itself should be there for it. So the idea needs the potential, but it also has an interest to develop this potential into an actuality. And this interest is also in its potentiality included, because if there were not this interest, then the potentiality would never develop, and therefore it could never develop, and therefore we could not call it a potential. So it's the concreteness, the determinateness of the idea to develop itself into what it is. And of course it's a contradiction, because it's not yet there, but not being there needs to be a part of what it is. Can we hold out such a contradiction? That's the big question, whether we want to be Hegelians or non-Hegelians. It is a common prejudice, so now we come to a new thought. I hope up to here everything was clear. Please let me know in the comments if it is too unclear, and if maybe we can go in the comments through these questions again. That would be very helpful, so don't hesitate to write comments or criticisms. Don't be too harsh. I try to do my best, right? It is a common prejudice that the science of philosophy deals only with abstractions and empty generalities, and that sense perception, our empirical self-consciousness, natural instinct, and the feelings of everyday life lie, on the contrary, in the region of the concrete and the self-determined. Okay, so here we have a prejudice. We always say, oh, philosophy is just abstract generalities. But the real truth is like when we really sense something and when we really live. Now, let's see why that is a prejudice. As a matter of fact, philosophy is in the region of thought. Okay, philosophy deals with universals, it's thinking, right? And has therefore to deal with universals. Universals are thoughts about like all men are mortal. Even the idea of red is a universal, right? I mean, we see the concrete red, but the idea of it is a universal. So we could say without a concrete thing, without an individual, it's empty. Okay. However, let's go on. In itself, the idea is really concrete. Oh wait, I skipped. Did I skip? And has therefore to deal with universals. Its content is abstract, but only as to form and element. Okay, here the content of philosophy is indeed abstract, but let's look at the idea. The idea itself is really concrete, for it is the union of different determinations. So because the idea deals with something that it tries to unify, it's concrete. So I think we have to see it like that. If understanding tries to understand itself, it deals with understanding. So therefore, it does not just deal with the universal, but it deals with something that is really there. That is really there at the moment where it thinks itself. So philosophy is the project of us thinking ourselves as reasonable beings. And as we try to do that, that's actually reason, where reason tries to become itself, and therefore it's concrete. It is here that reason knowledge differs from mere knowledge of the understanding. And it is the business of philosophy, as opposed to understanding, to show that the truth or the idea does not consist in empty generalities, but in universals, and that is within itself the particular and the determined. So this is a repetition of what I just said. So reason is not just that I give you the laws of logic, because they may be empty, A equals A, that may be empty. But I try to understand myself as this thinking individual. And so therefore there is a concrete content, and that's humans themselves that try to think themselves. And here's where Hegel wants to establish an identity of spirit, or that's what spirit is, the identity. But I'm sorry, this may lead to a wrong road, so let's not dive into that idea. If the truth is abstract, it must be untrue. So truth always has to be concrete, and concreteness lies in the development of the truths. Healthy human reason goes out towards what is concrete. The reflection of the understanding comes first as abstract and untrue, correct in theory only, and amongst other things, unpractical. Philosophy is what is most antagonistic to abstraction, and it leads back to the concrete. Okay, so Hegel says if we just think without any relation to practice, then it's untrue. But philosophy is a practice. It's not just empty theoretical thought, if we do it in the right way. And he says it's healthy if we want to go to the concrete. If we unite the notion of the concrete with that of development, we have the motion of the concrete. So the concrete is moving, right? That's what I try to say all the time, and I hope I can make it most clear to you. Since the implicit is already concrete within itself, and we only set forth what is implicitly there, the new form which now looks different and which was formerly shut up in the original unity is merely distinguished. Okay, what do we have here? So we say here the implicit is already concrete within itself. So that's the potential that develops, and it is already the concrete content, because if it wouldn't develop, then it wouldn't be a potential. That's what I tried to argue before. And we are only trying to develop what is implicitly there. And the new form which comes out of the implicit then, of course, is different than it was just the potential, okay? And it was just shut in the original unity of the implicit and the explicit, but now it's distinguished, it comes to the fore. The concrete must become for itself or explicit, and Brandom, the philosopher from Pittsburgh, really loves that. As implicit or potential, it is only undifferentiated within itself, not as yet explicitly set forth, but still in a state of unity. So the unity as a stable unity, not developing, is not what it really can remain. It has to develop, otherwise it's dead. It's just formal thought, it's not practical, it's not reasoning activity which humans participate in. The concrete is thus simple and yet at the same time differentiated. Here's a contradiction, right? It has to be a unity because truth is one, as we've said before, but at the same time it has to differentiate. And this is again the contradiction that we encountered since the first moment of these lectures, where philosophy has to develop, but how can it develop if it's really related to the truth? But this is its truth, that it develops. The concrete is thus simple and yet at the same time differentiated. This, its inward contradiction, which is indeed the impelling force in development, brings distinction into being. But thus too, its right to be taken back and reinstated extends beyond the difference, for its truth is only be found in unity. So now we have a back and forth, back and forth. Life, both that which is in nature and that which is of the idea of mind within itself, is thus manifested. So this is the cycle of life. It goes to the abstract death, and then it returns as the practical action again. Were the idea abstract, it would simply be the highest conceivable existence, like God, and that would be all that could be said of it. But such a God is the product of the understanding of modern times. This is not what we want to do. Okay, we are not dealing with this kind of God. A God that is not developing wouldn't be true. It would just be an inapproachable entity. What is true is rather found in motion. So it has to be found in the activity of reason, in a process, however, in which there is rest. Difference while it lasts is but a temporary condition, through which comes unity full and concrete. So we have here the idea of Heraclitus, that everything flows, and that flowing is a constant. And the flowing itself is the flowing of flowing. Okay, I hope this does not become too crazy. You can see why Schopenhauer is so contrarian, like he tries to criticize Hegel so much, because are we still doing real stuff here? What do you think? We may now proceed to give examples of sensuous things, which will help us further to explain this notion of the concrete. Start with the flower, so now we come with examples. Although the flower has many qualities such as smell, taste, form, color, etc., yet it is one. A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. And yeah, it consists of many things which are not one, they are differentiated, but it is one. It's redness, it smells, has different shapes and forms, and so on and so forth. It has a green part, it has a red part. They contradict each other, but in the oneness of the flower, they are one. Contraries united. None of these qualities could be absent in the particular leaf or flower. Each individual part of the leaf shares alike all the qualities of the leaf entire. So the flower has many parts that contradict each other. They separate in space and their own entities, but they belong to the oneness of the flower. The contradiction belongs to it. If there were no contradiction in the flower, what would the flower be? If there were no redness and greenness at the same time, if there were not different particles that couldn't be unified completely, there would be no unity. Gold, similarly, contains in every particle all its qualities, unseparated and entire. It is frequently allowed with, so like gold, the example of gold is the same, has many particles, and however, they are unseparated at the same time as they are separated. It is frequently allowed with sensuous things that such varied elements may be joined together, but in the spiritual differentiation is supposed to involve opposition. Okay, this is just a repetition what I've said, like there's unity, but also there needs to be opposition. We do not controvert the fact or think it contradictory that the smell and the taste of the flower, although otherwise opposed, are yet clearly in one subject. Nor do we place the one against the other. But the understanding and understanding thought find everything of a different kind placed in conjunction to be incompatible. So if we just have understanding, there are laws of logic, and then we have the principle of non-contradiction, which says that something cannot be A and not A at the same time. Okay? And then nothing works. So we need reason to overcome this kind of contradiction. And we have another example. Matter, for example, is complex and coherent, or space is continuous and uninterrupted. So matter is particular, while space is continuous and uninterrupted. Likewise, we may take separate points in space and break up matter, dividing it ever further into infinity. So we have a continuous space, but if we start dividing it, we say it's like matter. Matter can be infinitely divided and form a concrete point. Point is like the infinite division of space, right? And it cannot be divided any further, and so therefore it's a concrete. But there's a contradiction, because space, which is continuous, cannot have points that have matter. It's to be infinitely divisible. Likewise, but at the same time it shouldn't be divided. So likewise, we may take separate points in space and break up matter, dividing it further, ever further into infinity. It then is said that matter consists of atoms and points, and hence is not continuous. Therefore, we have here two determinations of continuity and of definite points, which understanding regards as mutually exclusive, combined in one. So this is just another contradiction that gets combined into one. I really want to finish like this text today, this part. So I will speed up a bit. It's just like the display of different contradictions. It is said that matter must be clearly either continuous or divisible in points, but in reality it has both qualities. Same point here, the contradiction in a unity. Or when we say of the mind of man that it has freedom, the understanding at once brings up the other quality, which is in this case necessity, saying that if mind is free, it is not in subjection to necessity, and inversely, if its will and thought are determined through necessity, it is not free. So here with freedom, I don't want to dive deeply into the subject. We have a similar contradiction, and many people in the space of science, they just remain on one side. They say, well, No, we're not free. Come on. Like freedom is so contradictory. But Hegel says that's exactly it. It's contradictory. We cannot think humans without the idea of freedom and without the idea of determination. We have to think it dialectically by virtue of reason. The one, they say, excludes the other. The distinctions here are regarded as exclusive and not as forming something concrete. But that which is true, the mind, is concrete, and its attributes are freedom and necessity. Haha, take that. But it is more difficult for us to show the unity here than in the case of natural objects. Freedom can, however, be also abstract freedom without necessity, which false freedom is self-will, and for that reason it is self-opposed, unconsciously limited, and imaginary freedom, which is free in form alone. So of course there are freedoms that are not freedoms, so we really have to get here the right idea of freedom. And most of the time people equivocate the idea of freedom with the other idea of freedom. So that means, like, they say the freedom to eat in a restaurant, whatever I want, is what freedom really is. And obviously we have shown in the Liebet experiments that your brain decides before what you want and your freedom is just an illusion. But let's not dive into that debate. This is just an example. Obviously we have to develop the right idea of freedom, which he doesn't do in this text here. The fruit of development, which comes third, is a result of motion. But inasmuch as it is merely the result of one stage in development, as being last in the stage, it is both the starting point and the first in order in another such stage. Okay, so like this is what I have said before, like the development includes the potential and the actuality. The potential is the beginning of the action, the actuality is the result, but the result cannot exist without further producing itself with having more potential, and so on and so forth. I just repeat the same thought again and again, and I hope I hammer it in our heads so that we really can deal with it as a concrete unity that we then can use like a brick and just build a house of Hegelian dialectics from it. Goethe somewhere truly says, that which is formed ever resolves itself back into its elements. So there is a dialectic of distinguishing itself and unifying, distinguishing itself and unifying. Now we have to capture that kind of development in a concrete idea. Matter, which as developed has form, constitutes once more the material for a new form. Mind again, so this is just an example of how matter is grasped in its form, but then we distinguish it itself as a new form, and so on and so forth. Mind again takes as its object and applies its activity to the notion in which, in going within itself, it has comprehended itself, which it is in form and being, and which has just been separated from it anew. So we have a new thought, then we say, you're false, we develop a new thought, this thought is false, we develop a new thought, and so on and so forth. And that is what philosophy is. You think something, you're false, you think something, you're false, but you connect all of these thoughts with each other, and then you get the concrete motion, which is the truth. The truth is the whole, as Hegel says. The application of thought to this supplies it with the form and determination of thought. This action thus further forms the previously formed, gives it additional determinations, makes it more determinate in itself, further developed and more profound. So the idea is that the more we apply this, the more we develop and the more determinate we become. So the thoughts are not lost in the past. They are preserved as parts of this movement that we run through. As concrete, this activity is a succession of processes in development which must be represented not as a straight line drawn out into vague infinity, but as a circle returning within itself, which as periphery has very many circles and whose whole is a large number of processes in development turning back within themselves. Okay, and this is really what I wanted to talk about today. I really pushed it like to a limit in the end. I wanted to make it like very fast. so that we can finish the thought. And I hope I didn't sacrifice the understanding of it here. But in the end, we see the development, which is a development of itself, and therefore it's concrete. And it's now we come to the thought that it's not a straight line, but that it is a circle that thinks itself again and again, that takes up itself. And this notion of the circle has to be developed in the coming chapters. And of course, it also has to be related to the idea of history again, where we started. And you see, the problem with this project is that it's really a question of intelligence and memory, because we have to somehow preserve what we have said before. It's not that I just deliver you a truth. It's being in this process. And I hope it's not too complicated. So what do you say? Does that make sense to you? What is the key takeaway that you have from this talk today? I would be interested in it. Write it in the comments. Nobody has commented so far. I hope I can attract some people who want to debate these topics. Not making it too complicated, staying close to the text, I hope. But yeah, I'm happy if people want to engage. So please do subscribe and live long, read more Hegel, and prosper. Bye-bye.